When Josiah was 7, the night carved itself into his bones, that it began with a scream, not the kind you hear in anger or even fear. This was something more primal, more guttural, the kind of sound that doesn't just echo through the walls, but seeps into them, the sound of a man being torn from his dignity. His father, Josiah, had pressed his cheek against the warped wooden wall, peering through a thin crack. He could barely see, but the flickering light from the torches outside cast violent shadows. Men with boots, white men, stormed into the cabin, their faces hard, unforgiving. His father, proud and tall, didn't cower. He refused to lower his head. He looked one of them in the eye. That was all it took. They didn't let him speak, didn't let him say goodbye. They dragged him into the mud without ceremony, like a sack of corn too heavy to carry with care. The last glimpse Josiah caught was his father's face, rage contorting into disbelief, then settling into something disturbingly calm, almost accepting, before the flames from the torches danced across it one final time. Thunder cracked the sky open as the door slammed shut. Rain pelted the earth, hard and loud, but it couldn't drown out the sound. That scream, his father's, stretched across the night like it had nowhere else to go, and even after it stopped, it lingered in the silence that followed. A warning, a ghost dot by dawn. Josiah was no longer a child. Not really. He followed the silence. Past the cotton fields wet with morning dew, past the broken coop where chickens fluttered as if something had unsettled their dreams, past Hannah's shack with the rotted roof, to the edge of the swamp where the cypress trees leaned like mourners. And there he was, his father hanging from a crooked branch, neck broken, eyes wide open, as if still searching for a sky that had betrayed him. Mud clung to his toes. A crow sat perched on his shoulder, too comfortable, too still, like it had been waiting there all night. They wouldn't let his mother, Lottie, cut him down. Said a man who died with pride should rot with it. But a field hand, shaking and whispering apologies to no one, did it under the cover of dusk. Josiah helped. His hands, too small for a task so sacred, trembled as he packed the dirt, one handful at a time. He didn't cry, didn't blink, just pushed the earth back into place. Lottie, once the boldest woman on the plantation, a midwife, a singer, the only one who dared talk back with a smirk, went silent, not quiet, silent, like someone had switched her off. She became something less than living, more than dead. She scrubbed floors that didn't need scrubbing, polished rusted iron until her fingers cracked, folded rags into perfect squares only to unfold them again. Her eyes stopped seeing people. She floated from chore to chore like smoke drifting from a dying fire. Josiah tried everything to call her back. Mint leaves for tea, sugar cubes stolen from the master's cupboard, a polished riverstone shaped like a heart. He placed them beside her, offerings to a temple that no longer spoke. She never looked at him, only hummed, not a tune but a sound, a long, low moan that barely moved the air. He would sit beside her at night, arms around his knees, hoping for a whisper, a glance, something to tell him she was still in there. Then came the night, the one that shattered what little was left. Charles, the master's eldest son, pale as raw dough, sweating rot, eyes drunk even when he wasn't. He entered their cabin without knocking. Josiah was curled on the mat in the corner, a rag for a blanket, pretending to sleep. But he saw it all. Charles said nothing, just walked to Lottie and grabbed her by the wrist. She didn't scream, didn't pull away. She stood like she was answering an order to shell peas. Her feet dragged across the floor, soft and slow, until the door closed behind them. Josiah lay there all night, counting the beats of his heart like they were trying to crawl out of his chest. She returned just before dawn, her dress torn, dried blood down her thigh, a twig caught in her hair like a cruel joke. She sat on the bed and stared at the wall. That morning she washed herself at the pump while birds sang overhead. Josiah watched, the heart-shaped stone clutched so tightly in his fist, his palm bled. She never looked at him, not once. Weeks passed. The humming stopped. Her hands began to shake. Josiah reached for her once, just to brush a tear from her cheek, and she flinched like he'd struck her. 3 months later, on a fog-heavy morning, she tied a faded red scarf around her head, the one she'd worn when she married, and walked barefoot toward the river. She didn't pack, didn't leave a note. She kissed Josiah on the forehead, the first time in months. Her voice, barely louder than the wind, whispered, "I'm going to wash the blood out." He followed her halfway, stopped where the trees ended and the river opened wide, watched as she stepped into the water, one slow step at a time, like she was entering a church. When it reached her shoulders, she looked back, not at him, but at the sky. Then she sank. She didn't come back. The overseers said she went mad. A weak woman, they called her. just like her man. Better off gone. But Josiah knew. He knew this wasn't madness. It was what happened when the world scraped a person hollow, took their voice, their dignity, their light, and left only pain behind. He sat by the river until dark, staring at the ripples where she vanished. He didn't cry, didn't move. When he finally walked back to the quarters, something in him had changed. Not broken, sealed, hardened like clay in fire. From that day on, Josiah stopped speaking unless spoken to. He worked without complaint, laughed at nothing, cried for no one. And in the quiet corners of the kitchen, where the grease clung to the air and the ash stained everything gray, a new hunger was born. Not for bread, not for comfort, a hunger for balance. By the time Josiah turned 10, his silence had become a kind of armor. The field hands said he was different, not strange, unnerving. He didn't cry when whipped, didn't beg when hungry, just stood there, still as a fence post, eyes fixed. On some invisible point past the horizon, they said he was born without a smile, that even as a baby he never cooed, never chuckled, just stared, watching everything with the gaze of someone twice his age and 3 times as tired. He was too small for the field's wiry, sharp-boned, fast-moving like a shadow with feet, and so the overseers reassigned him to the kitchen, not out of mercy but unease. He made grown men shift in their boots without saying a word. The kitchen was ruled by a woman named Mabel, thick-boned and tall, her skin deep as molasses, and her hands calloused from years of carving meat and wielding fire. She was no one's fool and everyone's fear. Even the mistress stepped lightly around her, because in the South, a woman who fed the white folks held more power than she was allowed to admit. She ran the kitchen like a warship. Knives were weapons, fire was discipline, and food was the gospel. At first, Mabel barely looked at Josiah. She'd slap a bird on the table, say gut, and walk away. If he hesitated, she'd pop his wrist without warning. Not like that, like this. She showed him how to snap a neck in one motion, clean, fast, silent, no squawking, no waste. How to skin the bird like peeling a glove. How to save the liver, the heart, the fat, everything. Throw nothing, she muttered. Wasting food is like burning a hymn. By 11, Josiah could gut a chicken in 20 seconds and have the bones boiling before 30. He could butcher pigs, stretch hide, smoke meat over sweet wood until the skin blistered like paper. He learned how to stir pots taller than he was, read boiling water like it was language, and balance flavors without measuring. Salt, pepper, lard, ash, vinegar. These became his new vocabulary. Mabel never used spoons to measure. She used memory, a pinch of sugar if the stew turned bitter, a splash of molasses to hide the rot in an old cut of meat, a lemon peel boiled in broth to lift a heavy heart. She didn't teach by speaking, she taught by moving. Josiah learned by watching her hands that stirred and slaughtered with the same grace. They didn't speak often, but something passed between them. A shadow mother, a mirror of quiet, and Josiah, for all his silence, never stopped learning. He learned how to knead bread without yeast, how to make soup thick enough to fool a starving man into thinking he'd eaten well, how to turn spoiled into savory, hunger into comfort. He watched the way white men devoured their meals, greedy, oblivious. He remembered which ones belched loudest, which ones always needed cream, which ones wiped their mouths like kings. After licking their fingers cleaned out by 15, he could cook a meal for 40 before sunrise and still have time to light the coals again. He never complained, never spoke out of turn. The mistress said he had a quiet spirit. The master called him Golden Hands. Guests praised his cooking with bourbon-heavy breath. Some said he was touched by God. Josiah just bowed. Yes, sir, but... In his mind, he was cataloging. A ledger was forming, not of money, but of weakness. A recipe book made of people. He remembered who had ulcers, who always took more gravy, who hated garlic, who left the table with a groan. He filed these things away the way cooks memorize ingredients, because Josiah wasn't cooking for compliments. He was collecting knowledge. He wasn't seasoning for taste. He was preparing for precision. What the white folks mistook for humility was actually a silence carved from blade edges. Their mistake was believing food made by black hands couldn't carry more than flavor. That was their weakness. At night, after Mabel snored herself to sleep on a stool, Josiah stayed up. He experimented, crushed leaves into paste, melted herbs into fat, cooked miniature meals in clay pots just to watch how bitterness reacted with sugar. He didn't try to kill, not yet. He tried to understand. How could flavor become blade? When he was 17, a guest from Charleston collapsed at dinner after eating garlic butter shrimp. His throat ballooned. He writhed on the floor, frothing and gasping. Allergic reaction, they said. Josiah stared at the half-eaten plate and thought, so garlic can be a blade. That night, a new kind of recipe started to simmer in his mind. Garlic plus butter equals swelling. Sweet root plus clove equals stomach pain. He wasn't writing a cookbook. He was crafting a new language. By 20, Mabel's hands had grown slow. Her sight clouded like river fog. Josiah took over. He prepared every meal for the master, the guests, even the pastor. Word spread beyond the plantation. The cook-boy with the hands of gold. Some joked he could make bark taste sweet. Others called him blessed. But Josiah didn't believe in blessings. Not after the tree. Not after the river. Not after watching the masters laugh with grease on their lips, while others starved. He believed in balance. In the way justice could simmer low and long, until it was ready to be served hot, without smoke, without warning. Each plate a study. Each bite a question. And when no one looked too closely, when they praised the flavor and wiped their mouths with embroidered cloths, Josiah knew what they didn't. Food was invisible. People didn't question what satisfied them. They trusted what fed them, and if it tasted good, it couldn't possibly be dangerous, especially not from him. And that made Josiah the most dangerous man in the house. The first time Josiah served death, it tasted like lamb stew and honeyed yams. It was spring, the air thick with pollen and lies. The birds had begun to sing again, but Josiah didn't hear them anymore. His world had quieted into routine, measured, sharpened, precise. Mr. Thaddeus Cullen arrived unannounced, as always, a cousin of the master's from Charleston, wealthy, loud, reeking of peach, rot, and arrogance. He was the kind of man who leaned too close when speaking, who laughed at his own cruelty and called it charm. He'd ruffled the hair of young slave girls and called them little flavors. He'd boast of New Orleans nights and women he'd never named. His boots tracked mud and shame in equal measure. Had watched Cullen for years, watched the bruises he left on wrists, heard the sounds behind pantry doors, saw the way the overseers smirked and the girls went silent. Every time Cullen walked away untouched, unquestioned. Boys will be boys. The master once chuckled after a complaint. A fly brushed from his wineglass, but Josiah didn't forget. He stored each moment like a seed. And now that seed had grown. Cullen wanted stew, rich, greasy, just the way he liked it. Josiah prepared it with his usual grace: garlic, cloves, lamb, fat, and roasted yams glazed in honey. But this time he added something new, a powder, bitter and fine, crushed from dried seed pods with the blunt end of a meat mallet. Weeks of testing had taught him its strength, not a poison in the usual sense, but a catalyst. It made the body turn on itself, coaxed the bile to rise, the stomach to twist, enough to bring a man to his knees without leaving a mark. At dinner, Cullen devoured it like a drunk at a wedding. He licked his fingers, burped, declared it the best damn stew this side of God. He reached to pat Josiah's cheek. "My golden boy," he slurred. Josiah didn't flinch. He bowed slightly and stepped away, silent. That night, the screaming began. Wet, guttural sounds rose from the guest quarters, like something inside Cullen was trying to escape. Candles flickered to life. The mistress clutched her shawl. The master barked orders. They found Cullen collapsed on the floor, drenched in sweat, vomiting black sludge. His eyes bulged, bloodshot. His hands clawed at his belly. He begged for water, for whiskey, for God. The doctor arrived near dawn, reeking of brandy. He sniffed the vomit and shook his head. "Bad liquor," he muttered. "Charleston whiskey'll kill a man faster than bullets." By sunrise, Cullen was dead. His mouth hung open, crooked, like it had frozen mid-joke. They cleaned the body, dressed it in silk. The mistress wept as they loaded him into a cart bound for Charleston. She placed a white rose on his chest. At least his last meal was something he loved, she whispered. Josiah stood on the kitchen steps, watching the cart disappear into the trees. He didn't blink, he didn't smile. But somewhere deep inside, where the grief had once lived, something stirred. Something full. That night, he sat by the fire pit, alone. He wasn't thinking about measurements, or flavor, or praise. He was listening to his own heartbeat, slow, heavy, a drumbeat. He had done it. Not out of rage, not with haste. With planning, with care. And no one suspected. The satisfaction wasn't sweet. It was savory, settled like a broth in the gut. In the days that followed, the house buzzed with theories. Some said it was cursed whiskey. Others whispered about ghosts. But no one blamed the cook. They never did. And that's when Josiah realized something elemental. Food was power. Silent, invisible, absolute. They praised his hands, but never questioned what they served, because they didn't see him as danger. They saw him as flavor, and that was their first mistake. From then on, Josiah moved with more purpose. Not louder, just sharper. He watched who visited the estate, who spoke with venom behind polite words, who demanded seconds, who sneered at the help. He began keeping a mental list, not of enemies but of appetites, who liked their meat rare, who hated spice, who had soft bellies and weak throats. He didn't want to kill for noise, he wanted to serve balance, one plate at a time. He refined his method. He tested ingredients on strays near the smokehouse, dogs, cats, rats, not to be cruel, but to understand the dance between dose and delay, which roots caused fever, which bark caused bleeding, which seeds thinned blood without bitterness. He took no notes, trusted no paper. Everything went into memory. A recipe of justice. One day, a girl named Sarabith, 12 years old, fingers like needles and eyes too curious for her age, began helping him behind the smokehouse. She thought he was teaching her to heal, to make teas for fevers, pastes for wounds. Josiah never corrected her. She learned how to dry leaves in moonlight, grind roots to dust. She believed it was medicine. In truth, she was making death soft enough to swallow. One day she asked, "Uncle Joe, what's this one do?" "Helps you sleep," Josiah said. She smiled. "You gonna give it to the mistress? She don't sleep at all." His knife paused mid-chop. He looked at her and forced a faint smile. Maybe one day. She laughed and kept pounding. She never knew what she was helping him build. She didn't need to. The poisons Josiah favored were quiet. No frothing at the mouth, no purple skin. That was for plays. He hated plays. His were subtle. Mimicked the South's own illnesses. Heatstroke, typhoid, food fever, slow deaths, unquestioned deaths. A man could eat pork on Sunday, work Monday, and die by Thursday. The doctor would say, "Bad heart," and Josiah would serve soup at the funeral. Because no one ever questioned the cook. Not then, not yet. By 22, Josiah was no longer just a cook. He was the rhythm of the kitchen, the invisible pulse that stirred the pots, bled the hogs, salted the hides. The others moved around him like planets in orbit, drawn by gravity they couldn't name. Mabel, old and near blind now, trusted him completely. Her hands had grown slow, her voice weak. But when she sat near the hearth, swaying softly in her chair, Josiah never had to ask for approval. He could feel it in the silence between her breaths. He handled every meal on the estate, from the master's Sunday roast to the field hands' cornbread and beans. Even the pastor who visited once a month said grace with more passion when Josiah's meals steamed before him. The guests raved, "Tastes like heaven." They'd say God himself stirred this stew. Some even asked if he could be loaned out a traveling miracle, like a golden skillet on legs. But Josiah didn't believe in miracles, not anymore. He believed in precision and justice. By now he had committed to memory every weakness of every man who passed through the big house, from their appetites to their ailments. He remembered who favored rich cream, who flinched at vinegar, who left their plates to clean too fast. He knew which men suffered ulcers, which ones bragged through indigestion. He had turned observation into a ledger, a mental book with no ink, only memory, where cruelty was converted into recipes. Because Josiah didn't kill with hate. He killed with understanding. He stirred the pot and studied the men, their gestures, their coughs, their complaints about headaches or sleepless nights, their drunken jokes, their cruelty. He didn't act on anger. He acted on accumulation. It started with a merchant named Benton Graves, a foul, sweaty man who visited monthly to inspect young slaves. He'd prod children like cattle, lifting their shirts, bending their arms, checking their teeth, laughing while mothers wept. Josiah served him pork belly braised in plum reduction, just a whisper of his most bitter compound in the glazed graves. Died 4 days later, vomiting blood, blind in one eye. The doctor blamed spoiled meat from Charleston. At his wake, Josiah served soup. Next came Reverend Fielding, the holy man who preached about order and obedience, who once said from the pulpit, slaves should thank their masters for saving their souls. That same Sunday, he cornered a teenage girl in the barn. Josiah made him sweet potato pie that afternoon, laced with the fine dust of a flour Josiah had always hesitated to use. Fielding's body unraveled over a weak fever, paralysis, hallucinations. By the end, he was singing psalms through a twitching mouth. The obituary blamed summer ague. Josiah baked biscuits for the funeral. Then there was Mr. Langdon, the loudmouthed guest who called slaves furniture, bragged about setting a runaway boy on fire. He loved okra stew. So Josiah made it for him, tender crab meat, perfect spice, and just enough of a delayed toxin to mimic a heat stroke. Langdon convulsed by morning, gone by noon. The master said he had a nervous disposition. Josiah said, "Yes, sir," and the list grew, not just of names, of lessons, because every death was a study, some too fast, some too slow, some too suspicious. He learned from each one, and behind the pantry wall, hidden beneath ladles and flour sacks, Josiah had carved a list with charcoal and the tip of a blade. He etched their names, their dates, the compounds used, sometimes a cross, sometimes just a circle. By the time Mr. Lyell, the northern journalist, arrived, there were 29 marks, 29 bodies that had left the plantation. Quieter, some of the names had nearly been forgotten, until Josiah wrote them down, not to boast, to remember, to refine. His poisons were never flashy. No blue lips, no screaming, no foaming at the mouth. That kind of death was noise. Josiah despised noise. His poisons sang slow, like spirituals under breath. They mimicked fever, heat, fatigue. They moved like the South itself, subtle, drawn, out, disguised. He tested them at night behind the smokehouse, fed tracers to strays, measured their breathing, noted the delays. No notebook, just memory. Because paper could be burned. Memory lived in his hands. Cerebeth, still young, still thinking she was learning healing, helped him grind roots and dry leaves. She asked too many questions. Josiah only answered the ones she needed to know. Sometimes she laughed and asked, "You're gonna give this one to the master?" Josiah would smile softly. Not yet, because the master would come later. For now, Josiah was selective, surgical. He never picked out of rage. He picked for balance, for the way a name sounded when whispered through clenched teeth, for the shape of a scar on a child's back, for the echo of silence that followed a girl's scream one day. He watched a guest raise a hand to a field girl for dropping a teacup, the crack of palm against cheek. Next day, Josiah served him fish glazed in sorghum and vinegar with a powder that caused mild strokes. By nightfall, the guest was twitching in his bed, speech slurred. They called it God's punishment. Josiah cleaned the plates and scrubbed the pans. No one suspected. He was just the cook. He made things taste good. He made people feel full, and no one ever looked too hard at what made them sick, because people don't question what satisfies them. And so Josiah stirred, measured, served, and behind his calm eyes, behind his perfect meals, behind every yes, sir, and every plate placed with care, the ledger grew, not of revenge, but of completion. Names crossed off, not in hatred, but in craft, in art, in balance. Behind the smokehouse, past the chicken coop and the broken fence no one bothered to mend, the trees grew thick and silent. That's where Josiah buried his experiments. Small animals, strays mostly, dogs, cats, rats, creatures who had unknowingly tasted the earliest drafts of his work. None of it was cruelty, it was study. Each grave a footnote and a recipe. Each paw, tooth, or curl of tail part of a truth he was trying to learn. The soil back there had grown dark with memory, but secrets, like bones, don't stay buried forever. One humid afternoon in June, a mangy dog wandered onto the property. Number 1 knew where it came from. Its ribs jutted from its sides, its fur patchy like moss on rot. It sniffed around the smokehouse and began to dig. A few children saw it first. They giggled, tossing pebbles at the dog until it pulled something pale and hard from the dirt. It was a jawbone, small, human. The laughter stopped. Whispers caught like sparks in dry grass. Some said it belonged to a baby born dead, buried in silence. Others said it was from a runaway boy who vanished years ago, but most of the eyes turned toward the kitchen, toward Josiah. They remembered how he spent long hours behind the smokehouse alone, how sometimes the meat smelled wrong, how they'd seen him talking to bones, laying them out like puzzle pieces before turning them to ash. A change passed through the quarters, invisible, sharp as splinters. Children were warned not to follow Josiah anymore. Even the bold boys who used to sneak into the kitchen for scraps now walked a wide path around it. Old Nettie, the oldest woman on the plantation, sat outside her cabin that night, shelling peas with her good eye glinting in the lantern light. "He ain't just cookin'," she rasped. "That boy's remembering every cut, cookin' ghosts into the meals." No one argued. The fear that once clung to the master now found a new home in the shape of a quiet cook. Mr. Platt, the overseer, had never liked Josiah, said he didn't look right, said he didn't flinch when punished, didn't shuffle his feet like the rest. He worked to clean the quiet. Now, with the bone in the dirt and the whispers thick in the air, Platt's suspicion turned to obsession. He lingered around the kitchen door more often, Asked too many questions. Why was the fire still burning after dark? How long had that meat been curing? Why were the knives arranged just so? Josiah answered every question in a flat, respectful tone. Always polite, always precise, but his eyes had changed. They were still calm, but something moved behind them now. A flicker, like the gleam on the edge of a blade before it drops. Then came the mistake. It wasn't Josiah's, it was Platt's. One morning, a boy named Elijah collapsed in the fields, 11 years old, thin as a cane stalk. He'd been coughing all week, his face pale, lips cracked, but Platt said he was faking, lazy. When Elijah dropped in the dirt, Platt didn't pause. He dragged the boy behind the barn and beat him with a switch until the skin split open. When the switch broke, he used his fists by the end. Elijah lay crumpled, breathing in gasps, one arm bent wrong, his back bleeding into the ground. Josiah watched it from the kitchen window. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. That night he made pork roast, sweet sorghum glaze, rosemary, thick cornbread soaked in buttermilk. He brought a plate to Platt himself. Eat yet? Platt grunted. Josiah shook his head. No sir, not yet. Platt muttered something about how they fed slaves better than the dogs and shoved another forkful into his mouth. Josiah bowed, turned, and washed his hands twice. Then he went to sleep. 3 days later, Platt woke coughing blood by noon. He couldn't stand by night. He was choking, his lungs filling with something thick and wet. The doctor called it lung rot, a convenient phrase for any death they couldn't explain. The master ordered the body buried before sunrise. No service, no sermon. Too risky, he said. Josiah served bacon and grits the next morning. No one spoke, but everyone knew. They didn't say his name out loud, but they left small bundles of sage and tobacco at the door to the kitchen. Not as warnings, as offerings. Something had shifted. Fear had become reverence. They whispered now, he ain't just a cook, he's a force. He feedin' more than mouths. Old Neddy was the only one bold enough to say it plain. That boy done crossed into something else. He feedin' spirits now. And still, Josiah said nothing. He chopped, stirred, seasoned. Outside. He was unchanged, a boy grown into silence, but inside, the ledger had grown longer. Every bruise, every insult, every cry he couldn't stop. They became ingredients. He didn't act on anger, he acted on memory. Because revenge to him was never a fire. It was a recipe, and now the whole plantation was beginning to taste it. It was a warm Tuesday morning in October when the man with the city shoes arrived. He stepped down from a dusty carriage in a fine wool coat, his notebook already in hand, his chin sharp, his eyes sharper. His name was Mr. Horace Lyle, a journalist from Philadelphia, writing something he called the Southern Soul, hospitality, industry, and the grace of the gentleman. The master welcomed him like a long-lost brother. Bourbon was poured before introductions were even complete. Fresh linen was set out. Even the porch dogs were scrubbed for the occasion. The house wanted to shine, and shine it did, but only on the surface. The slaves were warned, smile, move quickly, speak only when spoken to. The plantation was to look like heaven carved into cotton and brick. The truth was buried, like the bones behind the smokehouse lamp. Walked through the estate with careful politeness and constant scribbling. He asked about crops, about harvest, about food, but it wasn't his questions that worried Josiah. It was his listening. He listened too closely, looked too long. His gaze lingered on the kitchen door longer than any guest before him. He watched the field hands, watched who bowed and who flinched. He watched Josiah. That night, the master wanted a meal worthy of being written into history. Josiah obliged. He didn't rush. He never did. He moved like ritual, like a priest preparing a sacrifice. The menu: roasted duck breast, seared in browned butter and thyme, glazed with molasses and fire cider. On the side, wild greens, lard-soaked cornbread with honey, and chilled apples poached in spiced syrup. He plated it himself, one dish at a time, each portion perfect. And though the food sang with flavor, one note lingered in the background, something subtle, a compound Josiah had refined over months, a bitter oil extracted from the pit of a seed that, in high doses, would kill. But tonight, it was diluted just enough to unsettle. Not poison, not truly, just a test. Lyle ate slowly, eyes closed at times. He complimented the duck 3 times, asked if Josiah had ever cooked in Charleston. No sir, Josiah said. Then, he disappeared back into the kitchen like a shadow melting into ash. That night, around 2 a.m., the house stirred. Lyle woke, choking. He stumbled into the hall in his nightshirt, pale and drenched in sweat. He knocked over a candlestick, moaned for water. The mistress found him crouched against the wall, muttering, "It was the food. It was the food." The doctor was called, but Lyall refused treatment. He insisted on leaving at once. "Something's wrong here," he whispered, clutching his coat. "The air is too still." By sunrise, he was gone, rolled down the long dirt road, too sick to ride, too shaken to say goodbye. A week later, his article was published in a northern paper. The headline read, "Where the Magnolia Wilts, a visit to Middleton Plantation." The opening was filled with praise, the charm, the scenery, the aroma of bread from the kitchen, but halfway down, the tone shifted. "There is something here I cannot name. The food is exquisite, the servants polite, the rooms pristine, and yet, I felt as if I were dining in a house built atop a grave. There is a silence here, not peace, but a hush, like something buried is watching you." The master read the article in his study. Jaw clenched so tight he cracked a tooth. "Lies," he muttered. "Ungrateful northern bastard." The mistress prayed louder that night than she ever had. She placed a Bible beneath her pillow, burned herbs brought by old Nettie. The master started sleeping with a pistol under his bed. He claimed it was to protect against uprisings, but everyone knew better. Still, they kept asking Josiah to cook. His silence was too comforting, his meals too perfect. No one questioned where he learned to pull meat before it scorched, or how he always knew the exact hour bread should rise even without a clock. They didn't ask about the wall behind the pantry door, the one hidden behind sacks of flour and old ladles, the one only Josiah knew how to slide open. Behind it, the charcoal-scratched ledger grew longer. Some names had crosses, others had notes: boiled, delayed, fainting, no fever. By the time Lyall left Middleton, his name had been added, not with a mark of death, but with something new, a spark. Because Lyall had felt it, he couldn't name it, couldn't prove it. He felt it, and Josiah knew that mattered, because it meant the truth had begun to leak, not loudly, not in flames, but like smoke curling under a door, the kind no one sees until it's far too late. After Lyall's visit, the air at Middleton changed. Not in the fields, cotton still choked the rows, sweat still soaked collars. Not in the routines, bells still rang, orders still barked. But in the spirit of the house, something had curdled. Laughter at the dinner table came slower now. The master's temper thinned like broth left too long to boil. The mistress prayed more, lit more candles. Guests who once crowded the estate began sending polite regrets. And still, Josiah cooked, every day. He stirred with the same quiet rhythm, chopped with the same precision. But there was something beneath it now, something rising. Not just hunger, not just vengeance, confidence, the kind that settles in the chest after a first kill. The kind that lets you walk calmly into a room full of your enemies and serve them supper. The list behind the pantry wall had grown to 29 names. Not all dead, not all quick, but all accounted for. Some had died days after eating his food, their bodies unraveling quietly. Some had simply vanished, sold, relocated, forgotten. Some still lived, unaware that they'd been tasted, tested, marked for later. Josiah remembered every one not as victims, as lessons. Every error taught him a new note in the language of death. Some doses had been too strong, some too faint. Some had raised suspicion. He adjusted, refined, and always no one questioned the cook, but the ground had started to push back. One morning, a boy found something behind the smokehouse, the charred remains of an animal. It smelled off, like meat and metal. Another boy swore he saw smoke rising from the earth before dawn. Another said he found teeth in the ashes. More whispers followed. Children stopped stealing scraps. The bold ones no longer crept near the smokehouse. Even Mabel, nearly blind now, started muttering when he passed, but Josiah said nothing. Until one evening, while polishing copper pans, Mabel shuffled by and paused. She sniffed the air like a dog catching scent. Then she said, soft as a sigh, "You cook indifferent these days." Josiah didn't turn. He wiped the pan again and replied, "Just refining the flavor." She said nothing more, and that silence was the loudest thing in the room. The fire pit outside the kitchen began to collapse. The bricks cracked. No one could keep it lit past midnight. The meat spoiled faster. The air turned sour, heavy like breath held too long. The dogs stopped barking near the kitchen. The chickens refused to walk across a patch of earth behind the smokehouse. One girl claimed she smelled roasting meat when no fire had been lit. Another said she heard humming, the same tune Lottie once hummed, the one that sounded like morning. They tried cleaning, scrubbing, burning sage, but the scent always returned. a mix of ash, blood, and something older, something human. The master called it superstition. The mistress stopped eating meat entirely, and still, they asked Josiah to cook, because they couldn't stop. They feared him now, but they feared life without him even more. That was his power, and he wielded it quietly. One day, a guest named Mr. Alcott visited from Atlanta. He was clean-shaven, polite, and asked the mistress for extra sugar in his tea. At dinner, he praised Josiah's pork stew, complimented the texture of the greens, and went to bed humming. The next morning, his lips were blue, his pulse threatened. He couldn't speak, only moaned. The doctor blamed the heat, said, "These southern fevers sneak up on a man." No one questioned the kitchen, but Josiah added his name to the wall that night. A single mark, sweat, moan, no breath. That was the 30th name. He stood in the pantry afterward, running a finger over the etched lines in the wood. Each name felt like a chord in a larger song, a requiem only he could hear. He was composing something, not a plan, not a rebellion, but a correction, a world that tasted like justice. He still served the master tea every morning, still cooked stew for the field hands, still baked bread that rose perfectly, no matter the weather. But now, every dish was a choice, every ingredient, a sentence. Every guest, a test. They praised him for the warmth of his food, never knowing the fire they were feeding. After Alcott's collapse, silence thickened across Middleton like fog that never lifted. The guests kept coming, fewer, yes, but still arriving with polished boots and hollow laughter. But now they ate with a little more hesitation. They eyed their plates with suspicion before taking that first bite. They sipped wine and asked, "This spice, what is it?" Josiah always answered the same way, "Memory, sir," and they'd smile politely, not understanding, and swallow anyway. That was the beauty of it. They didn't need to understand, they just needed to eat, and Josiah made sure they did. The master began eating less. The mistress stopped touching her food altogether. She claimed her appetite had been haunted. She took tea in her room, now, barely speaking above a whisper. She lit candles before every meal, as if hoping prayer could purify her plate. Even the kitchen staff moved differently around. Josiah, they used to call him Ghost Boy behind his back. Now they called him nothing at all. They left him bundles of dried herbs outside the pantry, sage, tobacco root bundles tied in red string, not as offerings, not anymore, as warnings. "Don't look him in the eyes," one servant whispered. "Don't let him bless your food," said another. Josiah knew. He heard the murmurs, felt the distance, but it changed nothing, because by then, he wasn't cooking for them anymore. He was cooking for balance. Reverend Umsel Fielding had been buried 2 months by the time Josiah turned his attention to Langdon. Langdon was different, crueler, bolder, but kind of man who laughed when he hit you, who once called Josiah Golden Meat Boy, and spat near the fire pit while describing how he'd helped torch a runaway alive. Josiah didn't react, not with a twitch, not with a blink, but that night he went behind the smokehouse and lit a separate fire. The compound he prepared was one he'd only recently perfected, a bitter root ground into a dust so fine it disappeared in warm oil. He served it to Langdon in a dish of okra stew with crab and rice, rich, salty, thick with butter and lemon. Langdon licked his bowl cleaned up by morning. He couldn't breathe. By noon he was dead, his tongue swollen, his eyes rolled back in his head. The doctor said heat stroke. Josiah cleaned the bowl and added Langdon's name to the list that night, just beneath the Reverend's. No cross, no notes. Just the name. Some things needed no explanation. He became more careful, more methodical. He stopped experimenting. He knew the doses now. He could time the symptoms to the hour. He could make the illness mimic whatever he chose. Typhoid, consumption, nerves. He became a surgeon with a skillet, a priest with a ladle, and still, the white folks never suspected, because in their eyes he was talent, not threat, a servant, not a weapon. And that was their blindness, their weakness. They loved what comforted them, and Josiah knew how to comfort better than anyone. He never raised his voice, never spoke out of turn, never left a mess. Even when someone died, especially then, he would bring broth to the bedside, wipe foreheads with cool rags, whisper soft comforts into dying ears. He was always there, always kind. They trusted him, even as their bodies betrayed them, even as their skin yellowed and their teeth loosened and the light behind their eyes dimmed. They trusted him, and Josiah watched. Not with grief, with study. He watched them fall apart the way his mother had, quietly, in pieces, one breath at a time, and when they were finally still, when the final exhale slipped from their lips like steam from a simmering pot, he would take his own deep breath. Then, and only then, could he sleep. Some nights he sat barefoot in the dirt behind the kitchen, staring at the sky. He didn't speak, didn't pray. He just listened to the frogs, to the wind, to the echo of the rope his father had once hung from. He wasn't looking for answers. He was listening to the hymn only he could hear, a quiet song made of footsteps, whispered names, soup stirred slowly, and the sound of justice cooling on a plate. By the end of summer, 3 more guests had fallen sick. 2 had died. 1 had been sent back to Savannah with a fever no doctor could name. The master didn't speak Josiah's name anymore. He simply waved toward the kitchen and said, "Let him handle it." The mistress wept often. She locked her door. She fasted for days. When she finally did eat, it was only Josiah's bread, plain and dry. But even then, she trembled as she chewed. And still, they kept asking him to cook, because fear, Josiah had come to learn, was no match for comfort, and comfort, warm, spiced, sweet-smelling, was something he could summon at will. He wasn't just the cook anymore. He was the air in their lungs, the fire beneath their table, the god of their meals. The child's bone shattered the silence, not a full skeleton. Just a single piece, unearthed by a mongrel dog nosing through the dirt behind the smokehouse. A jawbone, small as a doll's, too small to belong to anything but a very young child. Stopped the world. The laughter in the quarters froze. The field hands stared at one another with wide eyes and tight mouths. Some claimed it belonged to a baby born dead in the night, buried in secret. Others said it was the remains of a boy sold off years ago, returned to the earth by bad fate. But most didn't speak at all. They just looked at Josiah. The whispers rose again, not like gossip, but like prayers, low, trembling, urgent. He buries his work there, someone said. Animals at first. Now, maybe not. I heard he talks to the bones, said another, lays them out like recipes. They remembered how he boiled things in clay pots late into the night, how the fire in the smokehouse never truly died, how sometimes the meat smelled wrong, not rotten, not spoiled, just wrong. Some began to leave protective charms at his door again, nails tied in red string, tobacco bundles, salt in corners, but Josiah never flinched. He stirred his pots, chopped his herbs, served each plate without pause. He didn't chase the rumors away, he let them grow, because fear was a kind of power, and power, quiet and consistent, was something Josiah understood better than anyone. Mr. Platt, the overseer, took the bone as a sign. He had never liked Josiah, said he was too clean, too calm, said a good slave should sweat, groan, cry, but Josiah just worked, efficient, silent, always watching. Now Platt had what he needed, a reason to act. He started prowling the kitchen, unannounced, sniffing around, like a dog that had caught scent. He questioned everything. How long had that roast been curing? Why was the fire still burning after midnight? Why were there 2 pans in the pit when only 1 meal had been served? Josiah answered each question like a him.com. Direct. Dull. Platt found nothing that made him angrier. He started blaming Josiah for spoiled meat, misplaced knives, and even the sudden illness of a guest who'd clearly drunk too much wine. But Josiah never argued. He just nodded and fixed what needed fixing. Yet behind those still eyes, something new flickered, not panic or calculation. Then Platt made a mistake. Elijah was only a boy of bone and breath, coughing for days, too weak for the fields. But Platt wouldn't let him rest, called him lazy, weak. That morning, Elijah collapsed face first into the dirt, his mouth foaming with sun and sickness. Platt snapped, dragged the boy behind the barn, beat him with a switch until it broke. Then with his fists when he stopped. Elijah was barely breathing, his back split, one arm twisted wrong. Josiah had watched from the kitchen window. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his hands clenched the edge of the table so hard, the wood splintered. That night, Josiah made pork roast, sorghum glaze, rosemary cornbread soaked in buttermilk. He brought the plate to Platt himself. "You eat yet?" Platt muttered. Josiah bowed. "Not yet, sir." Platt snorted and shoveled food into his mouth like a man who believed himself untouchable. Josiah returned to the kitchen, washed his hands twice, then went to bed. 3 days later, Platt began coughing blood. By noon he couldn't walk. By night, he was drowning in his own lungs. The doctor muttered, "Lung rot, a catch-all for failure, for mystery, for guilt." The master ordered him buried before dawn. No mourning, no prayer, just dirt and silence. Josiah served breakfast like always, bacon, corn, grits, molasses, biscuits. No one said a word, but something had shifted. Not fear, not suspicion. Reverence. Women left sage at Josiah's door. Again, not to ward him off, but to honor him. Old Nettie, the woman who had survived everything and seen more than most, said it loud enough for the whole quarter to hear. That boy Dunn stepped across. He feed in something bigger now, and still Josiah cooked, still silent, still precise, but now his ledger was growing with more than names. It held the weight of new eyes, eyes watching him with awe, not just suspicion. Children peeked from doorways when he passed. Men bowed their heads when he handed them food. Even Mabel, half-blind, started whispering again when he stirred his pots. He never spoke of Platt, never said his name again. But behind the pantry wall he etched it. Not just the name, the dosage, the method, the delay between breath and blood. He wasn't building a kill list. He was perfecting an art, and now he was no longer invisible. He was sacred. They never summoned a judge. No preacher was called to read scripture. No white man dared offer prayer. But the noose had already been tied. The same cypress tree that had once held Josiah's father now waited for the sun. Quiet, crooked, heavy, with ghosts. They didn't arrest Josiah like a criminal. They surrounded him like a wildfire. By then, it was no longer suspicion, it was proof. The hidden space behind the pantry had been found. A loose board, a seam that didn't match. Behind it, jars upon jars, powders of green and rust, bundles of dried herbs tied in black thread, a pouch of teeth, human, yellowed, burned. And then the wall, scratched into the wood like scripture. A ledger of names, dates, symptoms, doses, some underlined, some marked with crosses. Every name belonged to someone who had died on that land. The cook's wall, his altar. They pulled Josiah from the kitchen, in silence. He didn't resist, didn't plead, didn't scream. He just looked up at the sky, that same sky his mother had once looked to before sinking into the river. Someone asked, barely a whisper, "Why'd you do it?" Josiah turned his head slowly, voice as calm as always. "I just fed them like they fed us." They locked him in the old grain shed until morning. The master paced, the mistress wept. The field hands watched the house like it might collapse at any moment. But before the sun rose, Josiah made one final request. He didn't ask for mercy, didn't beg for his life. He simply said, "Let me cook." The master turned pale. The mistress screamed. But something, fear perhaps, or guilt, made the master nod. And so they let him know, chains, no guards. He walked back into the kitchen, barefoot, every step deliberate, quiet, final. The fire was already lit. His knives, his pots, his worn cutting board, all exactly where he had left them. He cooked in silence. No poisons, no powders, just food, the way he once had, before everything had been carved from grief. He fried corn cakes until their edges browned and bubbled. He roasted rabbit in sage and vinegar. He brewed tea so dark it looked like river water, sweetened only with honey. He plated it all carefully. No one dared eat, no one dared speak. He didn't offer it to anyone. He simply turned, extended his wrists, and walked out. The sun was low in the sky by the time they took him to the tree. No crowd jeered, no stones were thrown, just stillness, tight jaws, bent heads. Josiah didn't flinch when the rope slid around his neck. He didn't look at the master, didn't seek the mistress's eyes, didn't whisper forgiveness. When the trap dropped, his body swung in silence, and in that moment nothing moved. No wind, no birds, not even the insects stirred. As if the world itself was holding its breath. They buried him behind the kitchen, not in the graveyard, not among the others, alone, far from the fields. A hole dug quick, filled faster. No stone, no name, just dirt, and rock and fear. But the ground rejected him. Within a week, the grass above his grave shriveled. By spring, it was cracked dust. Chickens refused to walk across it. Dogs howled at night when they passed it. One worker swore he saw smoke curling from the earth before dawn. Another claimed he smelled roasting meat when no fire had been lit. The kitchen changed. They tried cleaning it, scrubbing it raw, tore out the hearth, replaced the stone, burned sage in every corner. But the scent never left. Not just the scent of ash or blood, something deeper, like memory, like warning. They brought in new cooks. None lasted more than a season. Some refused to stay past sunset. One swore he saw Josiah's shadow in the pantry just once, but clear as morning. Eventually, they boarded the kitchen shut. The master stopped eating there altogether. The mistress rarely left her bedroom. The estate grew quiet. No laughter at the dinner table. No guests eager to visit, just dust settling where opulence used to sit. Years passed. Then in 1872, fire came. No lightning, no fallen lamp, just flames. rising in the night from the very place Josiah once stirred his pots. The kitchen went first, then the rafters, then the walls. The house didn't collapse, it screamed. The portraits bubbled in the heat. The columns cracked like bones. By morning, nothing remained but blackened beams and smoke twisting up like prayer. The official story was a storm, God's will. But those who remembered, Josiah said otherwise. Said he came back, said he stoked the fire himself, log by log, the way he used to when preparing a roast. They say he's still out there, in the ashes, in the smoke, in the breeze that smells faintly of sugar and fire, still cooking, still waiting, not for food, but for the world to taste what it did to him. The earth doesn't forget, not bone, not blood, not the echo of a man who served justice by the plateful. Long after the fire swallowed the house and silence blanketed the fields, something still stirred at Middleton. The weeds grew thicker where the dining room once stood. The air smelled faintly of burnt honey and smoked meat. The old fire pit blackened, shattered, still smoked in the morning, though no fire had been lit in years. Children who wandered too close claimed to hear whispering. One girl said she saw a man in the windowless kitchen, stirring something that glowed. She swore he turned and smiled at her, though he had no eyes. Just hollow shadows and hands the color of ash. They called it nonsense. They always do. Until too many others saw it too. The land became cursed, they said. Nothing grew on the western edge. Animals refused to cross it. Tools rusted overnight. Windows cracked with no cause. A preacher once came to bless the soil. He made it as far as the old pantry before collapsing, breathless, mumbling something about a ledger that still breathed. Townspeople called the place haunted. Some came to gawk, whisper prayers, leave offerings, bread, tobacco, coins, not to honor Josiah, to keep him away. Then came the dreams. It started with the descendants of the original household, the master's bloodline, now thinned and spread across the South. They dreamt of the kitchen, always the kitchen, always from the perspective of someone standing at the stove, stirring with slow, perfect rhythm. They woke with the taste of iron on their tongues. Some claimed they couldn't eat meat for weeks after. One cousin starved himself to death, convinced every bite was being watched. Another woman, a schoolteacher in Mobile, woke screaming that the bread had eyes. The doctors said it was guilt, generational trauma, perhaps, but guilt doesn't leave burn marks on your floorboards. Back at Middleton, the ruins remained. No one rebuilt, no one dared, but the quarters still stood, weather-worn and hollow. One winter, a group of northern scholars came to research southern legacies. They stayed 2 nights. The lead professor, a man named Harlan, found the pantry wall, still there, still scorched, still covered in faint marks carved so deep into the wood they had survived fire. He traced one name with his finger, his skin blistered. Before he finished, they left before dawn, and the pantry, it closed itself, swung shut without a hinge. In the nearest town, an old woman named Nettie still sat on her porch, blind now, voice like gravel. When asked about Middleton, she didn't speak of slavery or fire. She just said, Josiah never left. He ain't walking no more, but he's still feeding. When asked what that meant, she just grinned without teeth. Yeah. Ever bite into something too sweet, and for a second, you taste grief? They didn't understand, but that night, the smell of roasted pork drifted through the town. No fire lit, no kitchens open, just scent and memory. A boy who lived near the edge of the old plantation wandered out one night. Drawn by the smell, he swore he saw a man at a fire, cooking in a cracked pot, stirring something thick and red. When the man turned, his eyes were pitch black, his apron burned, but he smiled, like an old friend. The boy ran, but he never forgot the taste in the air. It lingered for weeks. Salt, smoke, sorrow. They say, Josiah feeds the land now. Every injustice buried there becomes flavor, every unmarked grave an ingredient, every secret a seasoning, and the earth, it keeps the heat. Waiting, simmering. One day, someone will try to build again. A new owner, full of confidence and money, will walk the land and say, this will be a fine estate. And when he does, he'll light a fire in the hearth, he'll boil water, he'll set a pan on the stove, and that's when the smell will rise again. The scent of justice, served hot. It began with the wind, a southern wind that blew in from the bayou, carrying not rain, not ash, but the smell of burnt sugar and bile. No one saw the storm, no clouds, no lightning, but fences cracked, windows shattered in empty homes. The ground, near Middleton, split open in 3 places, each fracture running from the old kitchen ruins toward the edge of the cotton fields like veins. It was as if the earth itself had exhaled, and what came out was not smoke, it was memory. That spring, the Crops failed. No rain came, but mold bloomed anyway. Roots turned black. Corn unraveled in its husk like soggy parchment. Even the trees leaned away from the kitchen's remains, their trunks bent unnaturally, bark peeling like skin. The locals began speaking in riddles. A farmer swore his wife baked cornbread that wept. Another claimed their stew boiled cold. And a preacher, young, full of faith, came to walk the land, to banish the spirits. He lasted 2 hours, sprinted back to the church, barefoot, face pale as flour, muttering only, his fires still burning. The town called in a historian, a white woman with degrees and maps. She arrived in boots and bravado, claiming to document the ghost stories of the Reconstruction South. But what she found was not folklore, she found the ledger. Somehow, the scorched pantry wall still stood, blackened, yes, but intact. The wood had warped, but the names had deepened, not faded, not erased, deepened. She copied the names, crossed them with death records, journals, field ledgers, and she realized something. Every person who had ever crossed Josiah died. Some quickly, some slowly, but all of them, without exception, had been fed by him before the end, and all of them had been remembered. It wasn't murder, it was ritual, it wasn't revenge, it was correction. She published her findings in a short pamphlet titled The Cook's Justice. It barely sold, but among a certain circle, scholars, descendants, believers, it became legend, a new gospel, because people weren't just reading it, they were dreaming it. A man in Boston dreamed of boiling pots and soft-spoken voices. A woman in Houston saw a face in the steam above her tea. Children in Georgia began drawing forks with flames instead of tines. And in each case, when they woke, they were crying, but they didn't know why. Not fear, grief. At Middleton, the land grew more volatile. Grass wouldn't root, tools turned brittle. Birds avoided the airspace above the ruins. But in the middle of the worst drought in 10 years, rain fell just once. Right over the old smokehouse. A single dark cloud that hovered for exactly 7 minutes, pouring cold water that smelled like vinegar and bone. When the townspeople came to see it, they found a single loaf of bread sitting unburnt in the ash. Still warm. No one dared touch it. They built a fence, hung crosses, posted signs, marked the kitchen ruins as cursed on local maps, but the signs rotted, the fence collapsed, the crosses turned black, because you can't cage a hunger born of justice. You can't mark off sacred ground with pickets and fear. And Josiah's legacy wasn't a ghost, it was an inheritance. That fall, a young boy, dark-skinned, quiet, like Josiah once was, wandered into the ruins. They found him hours later, sitting beside the old fire pit, his fingers pressed into the dirt, murmuring something in a slow rhythm. "What's he saying?" a man asked. The boy looked up, eyes blank, and said, "Let me cook." There was never a monument, no statue, no plaque, no solemn ceremony beneath the cypress tree. The world didn't honor Josiah, but it couldn't forget him, either. Even when his name was buried, even when the house crumbled, even when the land was sold, fenced, renamed, his story moved beneath it all like water beneath dry stone. Because justice, when cooked slow enough, soaks in 50 years past. A new family bought the land. Strangers, they built a small house over the bones of the old kitchen, painted it yellow, hung curtains, planted sunflowers. They had no idea, not at first, but strange things happened. The air always smelt faintly of smoke, even on rain-soaked days. Bread never rose properly. One morning their daughter poured milk into a pan and it curdled without heat. The radio played hymns they didn't recognize, slow, aching things that made them cry without knowing why. And every now and then, something would knock gently from inside the pantry. The daughter, she began cooking, not with recipes. She said she felt it. The timing, the fire, the rhythm. She was 11 when she first whispered to her father, "I think someone's showing me how." He laughed, but the next day, she baked cornbread that made him weep. He didn't know why, just that it tasted like forgiveness wrapped in smoke. Locals stayed away. They remembered. Old men warned each other never to walk past the house after dark. Children dared one another to touch the porch and run. One teenage boy tried to spend the night there for a bet. He woke at dawn, standing barefoot in the ash behind the smokehouse ruins, holding a wooden spoon in one hand and muttering, "He's not done yet." The girl grew. Her cooking became legend. People came from towns away just to try her stew. No one could name the flavor. It was always something more than salt, more than fire. It tasted like memory, like justice, like mourning that didn't ask to be fixed, only acknowledged. She never spoke of the man who visited her dreams, but sometimes she hummed when she stirred. A low, old song that hadn't been sung since Middleton burned. They say Josiah walks no more, but his hands, his craft, never stopped. They passed down in fire, in instinct, in grief, cooked long enough to sweeten. He is no ghost. He is legacy. He is every boy who watches the pot just a little longer. Every woman who knows the moment before a boil turns to burn. Every hand that adds a final pinch of something dark and sacred into the broth, not for taste, but for truth. He is what the land remembers, and the land still feeds him. They say on the anniversary of the fire, if you stand near the old smokehouse just before dawn, you'll smell roasting meat. You'll feel warmth. Without flame, you'll hear the scrape of a spoon across cast iron. And if you listen closely enough to the quiet between wind gusts, you'll hear a voice, calm and steady, whisper, "It's ready."